The letter reached Philadelphia on a Tuesday morning in April 1847, landing at the offices of the American Journal of Medical Science. Dr. Samuel Morton, the editor, opened what he assumed would be another standard submission. The contents made his hands shake with such force that the pages slipped from his fingers twice before he could finish reading. The letter detailed a dissection, not particularly remarkable for a medical publication, except for the identity of the person who had performed it. According to every scientific principle, Morton had devoted his career to validating. This individual should have been incapable of comprehending human anatomy at all. The author, a Virginia plantation physician named Dr. Elias Cunningham, reported witnessing an enslaved man execute a flawless surgical procedure, describe organ functions with accuracy matching European textbooks, and demonstrate anatomical understanding that eluded many formally trained doctors. Morton's reaction was swift and absolute. He fed the letter to his fireplace. For 3 hours afterward, he sat motionless in his study, watching the flames consume the paper, aware that what he had just destroyed posed a greater threat than any abolitionist tract ever could. Because if Cunningham's account held truth, then Morton's entire body of work, his skull collections, his painstaking measurements, his published proofs of African intellectual inferiority, would turn to ash just as surely as that letter had. But knowledge, once witnessed, cannot be unwitnessed, and despite every attempt to suppress it, the truth about what transpired in Virginia between 1839 and 1847 would eventually emerge. That story follows, not the sanitized version, not the comforting fiction, but the Ginsher account of how one man's extraordinary mind shattered the scientific establishment, and why that establishment chose to destroy evidence rather than admit their error. Before we examine why this particular case threatened men whose reputations rested on racial science, let me pose a question. How often have you accepted something as scientifically proven, only to later discover the science had been manipulated to serve predetermined conclusions? If you're watching from any region where such manipulation continues today, comment with your location and hit subscribe, because what you're about to learn will transform your understanding of how science and power intersect in America. The Henley Plantation occupied Virginia's Tidewater region, where the James River carved through tobacco fields that had enriched the Henley family for 3 generations. By 1839, the operation ran with the precision of a well-oiled machine. 300 cultivated acres, 62 enslaved individuals whose labor generated wealth sufficient to send Henley sons to Philadelphia medical schools and marry Henley daughters into England's elite families. Thomas Henley, the patriarch, considered himself an enlightened slaveholder. He subscribed to agricultural journals, practiced crop rotation, and maintained what he viewed as progressive management of his workforce. No undocumented whippings. A contracted physician for medical care. Children remained with mothers until age 10. He genuinely believed these practices demonstrated his humanity, never recognizing that no amount of refinement could transform slavery into anything other than its essential nature. Within the enslaved community lived a young man named Samuel. The plantation records documented him unusually thoroughly. Born on the property in 1814, mother died in childbirth with her second child in 1817. Father unknown, though everyone understood that meant one of the Henley men. Assigned to house service at age 8. Noted as quick to learn, respectful in manner, suitable for skilled work. What the records couldn't capture was what Samuel carried within his skull. A mind of such precision and capacity that its full extent would have terrified anyone who comprehended it. From earliest childhood, Samuel perceived the world differently than those around him. Where others saw chaos, he detected patterns. He grasped systems intuitively. He retained everything with a clarity approaching the supernatural. At age 9, Samuel was present in the main house when Thomas Henley's youngest son, Robert, suffered a riding accident. The boy had been thrown, landing hard on his left side. The plantation physician, Dr. Nathaniel Webb, was summoned immediately. Samuel had been directed to fetch water and clean cloths, which positioned him to observe everything. Dr. Webb examined the boy carefully, palpating along the rib cage, watching for pain responses. He explained his findings to Thomas Henley, using medical terminology, assuming the enslaved child in the corner comprehended nothing. 3 ribs fractured, probably the 7th, 8th, and 9th on the left. Possible pleural compromise. Need to monitor for pneumothorax. Air in the chest cavity that could collapse the lung. If breathing becomes labored or fever develops, we may need to drain fluid. Samuel stood motionless by the door, but his mind seized every word. Without being told, he understood that ribs protected lungs. That broken ribs could puncture protective membranes. That misplaced air or fluid could kill. He visualized the anatomy from Webb's description, constructing mental images of structures he'd never seen yet somehow understood perfectly. During the following days, as young Robert recovered, Samuel observed the progression Webb had predicted. Initial swelling, careful breathing monitoring, gradual healing. Through this observation, Samuel began comprehending something profound about human physiology. It operated as a system, complex certainly, but governed by learnable rules. This awakening to anatomical knowledge might have remained dormant, never developing beyond curiosity, except for an unusual circumstance. Thomas Henley maintained a library containing his son's medical textbooks from their University of Pennsylvania years. These volumes sat largely undisturbed, the sons having completed their studies and moved to other pursuits. But the library required cleaning, and Samuel had been assigned that task. When Samuel first opened Gray's Anatomy, he experienced something approaching religious revelation. There, rendered in precise illustrations and detailed text, was the system he had intuited. Skeleton, muscles, organs, circulatory system, nervous system. Everything explained, everything connected, everything making perfect sense. He began reading in stolen moments. 10 minutes here, 15 there. Always careful to return books to their exact positions, always alert for approaching footsteps, always ready with a cleaning cloth should anyone enter. And what he read, he retained with absolute clarity. Not merely memorized, but genuinely understood. He could visualize structures, comprehend their functions, perceive how each system connected to every other. By age 15, Samuel had absorbed more anatomical knowledge than many practicing physicians possessed. He understood musculature with surgical precision. He could trace nerve pathways mentally. He grasped cardiovascular mechanics with clarity that would have impressed medical professors. And he kept this knowledge absolutely hidden, instinctively recognizing that revealing it would bring unpredictable consequences. The plantation maintained a sick house, a small building where enslaved individuals too ill to work received treatment. Dr. Webb visited weekly, more frequently during serious outbreaks. At 16, Samuel was assigned to assist there, placing him in regular, direct contact with medical practice. Watching Dr. Webb work proved simultaneously educational and frustrating. Educational because Samuel observed diagnosis and treatment in action. Frustrating because he recognized mistakes. Not catastrophic errors, but minor misunderstandings, outdated techniques. Treatments causing more harm than good. Dr. Webb was competent by 1830s standards, but medical knowledge advanced rapidly, and Webb hadn't kept current. Samuel never corrected him, never questioned, never revealed recognizing when Webb misdiagnosed pleurisy as simple fever or prescribed mercury for conditions where it would worsen rather than help. Samuel simply watched, learned, and cataloged both correct and incorrect practices, understanding the distinction with uncomfortable clarity. The transformative moment arrived in July 1834. Samuel was 20. A field worker named Joshua had been injured during tobacco harvesting. A putting blade slipped, opening a deep gash across his left forearm. Initially, the wound seemed straightforward. Dr. Webb cleaned it, applied stitches, and instructed keeping it wrapped and clean, but infection developed. By day 3, Joshua's arm had swollen red lines radiating from the wound. By day 5, he was feverish and delirious. Dr. Webb examined him and delivered his verdict to the overseer with grim certainty. Gangrene, immediate amputation, or the infection would spread and kill him. The surgery was scheduled for the following morning. Joshua would be held down by several men while Webb sawed through bone. A procedure that killed patients as often as it saved them. Samuel had helped prepare for amputations before. He knew what would follow. The screaming, the blood loss, the shock that killed men even when surgery technically succeeded. Unable to sleep that night, Samuel made a decision that would irrevocably alter multiple lives. He left the slave quarters after dark, a violation risking severe punishment, and made his way to the sick house. Joshua lay on a narrow bed, unconscious, breathing shallow. By candlelight, Samuel examined the infected arm. The wound had been stitched too tightly, preventing drainage. Infection had been trapped beneath the surface, spreading through tissue. But Samuel could see, with the clarity his anatomical knowledge provided, that the infection had not yet reached bone. If he reopened the wound, cleaned out infected tissue, allowed proper drainage, Joshua might heal without amputation. It was insane. He was an enslaved man with no medical training, no official knowledge, no authority. If Joshua died after Samuel's intervention, Samuel would be blamed, possibly executed, almost certainly sold away. Every survival instinct screamed at him to walk away, let Webb perform his amputation, remain invisible. Instead, Samuel sterilized a knife in boiling water. He removed Webb's stitches carefully. He opened the wound wider, cleaned out necrotic tissue, irrigated with alcohol that made the unconscious man groan. He packed the wound with clean cloth, left it open to drain. He elevated the arm to reduce swelling. Then he sat beside Joshua through the night, monitoring breathing, pulse, color. By morning, Joshua's fever had broken. The angry red lines had stopped advancing. Swelling had begun to reduce. When Dr. Webb arrived expecting to perform an amputation, he found Joshua awake, weak but alive. His arm was painful, but clearly healing. Webb stared at the opened wound with confusion that cycled through several emotions: surprise, professional curiosity, then something harder to identify. He questioned the overseer. Who had tampered with his patient? Who had removed the stitches? Who had dared interfere with his medical judgment? The overseer had noticed Samuel entering the sick house during the night. Under questioning, Samuel admitted what he had done, but couldn't explain how he had known what to do, couldn't reveal years of secret study, couldn't acknowledge anatomical knowledge that should have been impossible for him to possess. Dr. Webb examined Joshua's wound carefully. The treatment had been correct. More than correct, sophisticated, demonstrating understanding of infection, drainage, tissue viability. Webb had seen trained surgeons make worse decisions. He looked at Samuel with an expression mixing confusion with something approaching fear. "What exactly did you do?" Webb asked. Samuel kept his eyes down. "I cleaned the wound, sir. Let it drain, kept it elevated." "How did you know to do that?" "I watched you work, sir. Tried to remember what you taught about keeping wounds clean." It was a plausible lie. Barely. Doctor. Webb accepted it because the alternative, that an enslaved man possessed medical knowledge rivaling or exceeding his own, was simply too impossible to contemplate. But Webb began watching Samuel more carefully after that, testing him with small questions, asking him to identify instruments, observing his movements in the sick house. Over following months, Dr. Webb's suspicions grew. Samuel moved too confidently, anticipated needs before being asked, recognized conditions before Webb completed examinations. It was subtle, easy to dismiss as coincidence or good instinct. But Webb was too experienced to dismiss it entirely. The confrontation came in November. Webb had been treating a woman named Martha for persistent abdominal pain. His diagnosis was hysteria, a common catch-all for women's ailments when doctors couldn't identify specific causes. He prescribed laudanum and rest, but Martha continued deteriorating, her pain worsening, her abdomen swelling. Samuel knew what was wrong. The symptoms matched appendicitis or possibly an ovarian cyst. Diagnosis was crucial because treatment would differ, but he said nothing, knowing any diagnosis from him would be dismissed or, worse, result in punishment for presuming medical knowledge. Martha died 3 days later. The brief autopsy Webb performed revealed a ruptured appendix, infection spreading throughout her abdominal cavity. She might have been saved. Possibly if diagnosis had come earlier. Possibly surgery would have been dangerous, but she'd had no chance once the appendix burst. After the autopsy, Webb found Samuel in the sick house. The doctor's expression was strange, haunted. He held a medical text open to a page about appendicitis. "You knew," Webb said quietly. "When I was treating her for hysteria, you knew what was actually wrong." Samuel said nothing. Silence seemed safest. "How long have you been reading medical texts? How much do you understand?" Still Samuel remained silent. Dr. Webb made a decision that would set everything else in motion. "I need to test something," he said. "Come to my office tomorrow evening. Tell no one." The testing began that first evening in Dr. Webb's private office, a room attached to his home 3 miles from the Henley plantation. Samuel arrived after dark, moving through shadows, every nerve alert to the danger. An enslaved man alone at a white man's home without permission or witnesses. If anyone saw him, if anyone questioned his presence, no explanation would save him. Webb's office smelled of leather, tobacco, and something chemical Samuel recognized as formaldehyde. The doctor sat behind a heavy desk, lamplight casting his face in sharp relief. On the desk lay 3 medical texts, spines facing Samuel. Webb gestured to a chair across from him, a small gesture violating every social convention. Enslaved people did not sit in white men's presence. But Webb seemed oblivious to this transgression. His mind focused entirely on the impossible thing he suspected. "Read the spine titles," Webb said. "Cunningham's Manual of Practical Anatomy, Douglas's Medical Dictionary, Cooper's Surgical Essays." Webb opened the Cunningham text to a random page, showing a detailed illustration of the human heart. He pointed to various structures. "Name these." The Samuel hesitated. This was the moment of no return. Once he revealed what he knew, consequences would follow that he couldn't predict. But silence itself was becoming a kind of lie, and something in Webb's expression suggested genuine curiosity rather than entrapment. "The right atrium," Samuel said quietly, pointing. "The right ventricle. The tricuspid valve between them. The pulmonary artery carrying deoxygenated blood to the lungs. The pulmonary veins returning oxygenated blood to the left atrium. The mitral valve. The left ventricle. The aorta carrying oxygenated blood to the body." Webb's hand had begun to shake slightly. "Explain the cardiac cycle." Samuel did, describing the sequence of contractions, blood movement through chambers, each valve's function, the pressure differentials driving circulation. He explained clearly, concisely, with the precision of someone who hadn't merely memorized text, but understood underlying mechanics completely. Webb closed the book slowly. His face had gone pale. "How long have you been studying medicine?" "7 years, sir. Maybe 8. Since I was assigned to clean the library." "And you understand what you've read?" "This isn't just memorization." "I understand it, sir. The body is a system. Once you understand principles, details make sense." Dr. Webb stood and walked to his window, staring into darkness. When he spoke again, his voice carried a strange mixture of wonder and fear. "Do you know what you are, Samuel? Do you understand how impossible you are?" Samuel said nothing. The question had no safe answer. "I spent years studying medicine," Webb continued. "Years in medical school, years of practice. And you, with no formal training, no instruction, no guidance beyond stolen reading, have achieved understanding matching or exceeding many physicians I know." He turned back to Samuel. "According to every scientific theory, according to everything we believe about racial capacity, what you've done should be impossible." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Samuel spoke. "Then perhaps the theories are wrong, sir." Webb flinched as if struck. Those words, spoken aloud, represented heresy against the entire scientific establishment. Against men like Samuel Morton, whose skull measurements supposedly proved African intellectual inferiority. Against Louis Agassiz, whose theories of separate racial origins dominated academic discourse. Against Josiah Nott and George Glidden, whose types of mankind claimed to scientifically demonstrate permanent racial hierarchies. "I could report this," Webb said slowly. "I should report this. What you represent threatens the entire intellectual foundation of Southern society." "Yes, sir." "But if I report it, you'll be sold away. Probably to a cotton or sugar plantation where your knowledge will die with you within a few years. The brutality of those places would destroy both the man and the mind." "Yes, sir." Webb returned to his desk and sat heavily. "I studied under Dr. Morton at the University of Pennsylvania. I've corresponded with the best medical minds in America. What I've discovered tonight challenges everything they taught me to believe." He looked directly at Samuel. "I need to understand the full extent of your knowledge, and I need to decide what that understanding means." Over following weeks, Webb tested Samuel systematically. He presented medical cases, both real and hypothetical, asking for diagnosis and treatment recommendations. He questioned Samuel about anatomy, physiology, pathology, surgery. He presented controversial cases where medical opinion divided, asking Samuel to evaluate competing approaches. Samuel's performance was consistently remarkable. He diagnosed conditions Webb had initially missed. He suggested treatments more advanced than Webb's usual approaches. He demonstrated understanding of medical principles, extending beyond book learning to genuine insight. When Webb described a patient with chest pain radiating to the left arm, Samuel immediately identified likely angina pectoris, a condition Webb had been treating as indigestion. When Webb mentioned a child with projectile vomiting, Samuel recognized pyloric stenosis before Webb described the palpable abdominal mass. But more unsettling than Samuel's diagnostic accuracy was his ability to reason through novel problems. Webb presented a hypothetical case, a man injured in a wagon accident with compound femoral fracture, severe bleeding, signs of internal injury. Samuel walked through triage decisions methodically. Control bleeding first. Tourniquet above the fracture site. Assess for hemorrhagic shock. Stabilize the fracture to prevent further femoral artery damage. Monitor for peritonitis signs, suggesting abdominal injury. He explained reasoning behind each step, physiological principles involved, risks of various interventions. This wasn't memorization. This was genuine medical reasoning requiring understanding of cause and effect, risk, benefit weighing, integration of multiple factors into coherent clinical judgment. Dr. Webb found himself in an impossible position. His scientific training insisted what he witnessed couldn't be real. The theories he'd studied, the measurements he'd been taught to trust, all claimed African descended people lacked mental architecture for this level of abstract reasoning. Yet the evidence sat before him, undeniable, collapsing those theories into absurdity. Webb began bringing Samuel increasingly difficult cases. A presentation on tetanus and its treatment, discussion of malarial fevers and their various manifestations, a complex surgical case involving strangulated hernia. Each time Samuel demonstrated not just knowledge, but judgment, the subtle clinical wisdom separating competent physicians from excellent ones. In December 1834, Dr. Webb made a decision crossing a line from which return was impossible. He began teaching Samuel directly, not merely testing independent learning, but actually instructing in areas where medical knowledge advanced beyond Henley Library textbooks. They met twice weekly, always after dark, always in secret. Webb taught Samuel about new European surgical techniques, advances in understanding infection and contagion, diagnostic methods revolutionizing medicine. He shared his clinical experience, lessons from success and failure, nuances no textbook fully captured. In teaching Samuel, Webb discovered something unexpected. Samuel wasn't merely a passive knowledge recipient. He asked questions challenging Webb's understanding. He identified inconsistencies in medical theory Webb had never noticed. He made connections between disparate areas of medical knowledge, illuminating both. During one session discussing disease transmission theories, Samuel posed a question that stopped Webb cold. If miasma, bad air, causes diseases like cholera and yellow fever, why don't physicians and nurses treating these patients fall ill at higher rates than others exposed to the same air? Shouldn't proximity to the sick make medical professionals more vulnerable if air alone carries disease? Webb had no answer. Miasma theory was accepted medical doctrine, but Samuel had identified a logical flaw observation didn't support. Physicians and nurses sometimes contracted diseases from patients, but not at rates miasma theory would predict. The question suggested something else at work, something more specific than contaminated air. Years later, when germ theory revolutionized medicine, Webb would remember this conversation and realize Samuel had intuited the direction medical science would eventually take, simply by observing that accepted theories didn't match observed reality. The turning point came in March 1835. A field worker named Isaac suffered a terrible accident. His right hand crushed in a tobacco press. By the time he reached the sick house, damage was catastrophic. Bones shattered, tendons severed, blood vessels destroyed. Dr. Webb examined the injury and delivered immediate verdict. The hand can't be saved. We must amputate at the wrist. Samuel stood nearby observing. He saw what Webb saw, extensive damage, destroyed tissue. But he also saw something else. Major blood vessels in the forearm remained intact. Nerves, though damaged, hadn't been completely severed. If crushed bones could be removed, tendons repaired, wound kept clean, preserving at least partial function remained possible. A desperate possibility. Surgery far more complex than simple amputation. Recovery long and painful with no guarantee of success. But amputation guaranteed disability, while reconstruction offered a chance, however slim, of maintaining some hand use. Samuel spoke without thinking. Dr. Webb, could I speak with you privately? In the small office adjacent to the sick house, Samuel laid out what he saw. Salvageable anatomy, surgical approach that might work, specific techniques for tendon repair, debridement of crushed bone, infection risk management. He spoke quickly, urgently, knowing Isaac lay in agony awaiting Webb's decision. "Doctor." Webb listened with an expression of growing conflict. "What you're describing is theoretically sound, but I've never performed surgery that complex. I'm not certain I have the skill." "Then let me do it," Samuel said. The words emerged before he could stop them. The room went silent. The enormity of Samuel's suggestion hung between them. An enslaved man performing complex reconstructive surgery, using knowledge he wasn't supposed to possess, making decisions meaning difference between disability and function. Webb's face cycled through emotions too quickly to track. "If you fail, Isaac loses the hand anyway. But if you succeed, we face a different problem entirely. How do I explain that an enslaved man performed successful surgery that I couldn't?" Samuel met his eyes directly. "Does that matter more than Isaac's hand?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Finally, Webb spoke. "I'll tell them I supervised, that you assisted under my direct instruction. If questioned, we both maintain that story." "Absolutely." The surgery took 4 hours. Samuel worked with precision from his photographic memory of anatomical illustrations and understanding of three-dimensional spatial relationships. He removed crushed bone fragments carefully, preserving as much viable tissue as possible. He repaired severed tendons using techniques he'd read about but never practiced. He reconstructed damaged structures in correct anatomical alignment, fighting fatigue and responsibility weight with every suture. Dr. Webb assisted, following Samuel's instructions, handing instruments, maintaining retraction. In assisting, Webb observed surgical technique, exceeding his own considerable skill. Samuel's hands moved with confidence and precision. His decisions were immediate and correct. His understanding of anatomical relationships was three-dimensional and perfect. When surgery concluded, Isaac's hand had been reconstructed rather than removed. Fingers remained, swollen and damaged, but present. Thumb intact. Major structures preserved. Whether function would return remained uncertain, but possibility existed. Isaac recovered slowly, painfully, but recovered. 6 weeks after surgery, he could make a fist. 3 months later, he could grip tools. The hand would never be perfect, never possess original strength, but remained functional. Isaac returned to work, able to perform tasks impossible with only one hand. Dr. Webb watched this recovery with emotions tearing him in multiple directions. Professional pride at successful outcome. Intellectual excitement at witnessing surgical skill beyond his own. Existential dread at what this success meant for his understanding of racial capacity and human potential. The case became quietly famous within the enslaved community. Samuel, who had saved Joshua's arm, had now saved Isaac's hand. Word spread carefully through networks enslaved people maintained. When someone fell ill, when someone was injured, they asked for Samuel before asking for Dr. Webb. They trusted him in ways they could never trust a white physician, and their trust was rewarded with care exceeding anything they'd experienced before. Thomas Henley noticed the shift in how his enslaved workforce viewed Samuel, but misinterpreted its cause. He believed Samuel had become a skilled assistant to Dr. Webb, useful for managing minor injuries and routine ailments. This seemed entirely appropriate to Henley, evidence of the benevolent system he believed he maintained. A talented enslaved person, given opportunity to develop useful skills under proper white supervision, serving community in ways benefiting everyone. The reality was far more dangerous. Samuel had become, in practice if not title, the primary medical provider for the Henley Plantation's enslaved community. Dr. Webb had become his assistant rather than the reverse. Both men understood this arrangement violated every social, legal, and scientific principle governing their society. By 1836, Samuel's knowledge had expanded beyond medicine. The Henley Library contained books on natural philosophy, what Samuel recognized as physics and chemistry. He read Newton and Lavoisier with same comprehension he'd brought to medical texts. He understood mechanics, optics, properties of gases. He grasped chemical principles, reactions, element behavior. Dr. Webb, during one evening session, brought a problem he'd been struggling with: improving a chloroform formula, newly used as anesthetic. Concentrations were difficult to calculate, and Webb's chemistry was weak. Samuel worked through the problem, applying principles of molecular ratios and vapor pressure absorbed from chemistry texts. Within an hour, he derived correct formula, explaining underlying chemistry clearly enough that Webb understood not just the answer, but reasoning behind it. This moment, more than any other, crystallized Webb's crisis. Samuel wasn't just medically knowledgeable. He possessed a mind capable of mastering any intellectual domain encountered. Mathematics, chemistry, physics, logic, all yielded to his comprehension as readily as anatomy had. The limitations supposedly inherent to his race didn't manifest. The inferior mental architecture science claimed to have proven didn't exist in Samuel's case, which meant one of two things. Either Samuel was such an extraordinary anomaly, he represented no challenge to racial hierarchy theories. A single impossible exception, proving nothing about broader population. Or the theories themselves were fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. Dr. Webb spent sleepless nights wrestling with this question. He wrote letters to colleagues he never sent, drafts trying to explain what he'd discovered, while simultaneously defending scientific framework he'd been trained to accept. The letters always collapsed into incoherence, because reconciling what he'd witnessed with what he'd been taught to believe was impossible. In June 1837, a visiting physician from Richmond arrived at the Henley plantation. Dr. Marcus Whitfield was considering purchasing property in the area and wanted to observe local medical practices. Thomas Henley invited him to accompany Dr. Webb on rounds as courtesy between gentlemen. During the sick house visit, Samuel was present, assisting as usual. Dr. Whitfield observed Samuel handing Webb instruments, preparing medications, changing dressings. The visitor commented on Samuel's apparent competence, praising Henley for maintaining such a well-trained assistant for his physician. But then Whitfield witnessed something changing the visit's tenor. An enslaved woman had been brought in with high fever and severe headache. Dr. Webb examined her, noting symptoms, but seemed uncertain of diagnosis. Samuel, standing near the examination table, spoke quietly. "Deacon Webb, notice the stiffness in her neck when she tries to look down, and the sensitivity to light." Webb immediately understood. Meningitis, possibly bacterial, extremely dangerous. He began appropriate treatment, while Whitfield watched with growing unease. After examination concluded, and they'd left the sick house, Whitfield pulled Webb aside. "That assistant of yours, how much medical knowledge does he actually possess?" Webb felt ice form in his chest. "He assists with routine matters. He's observed enough to recognize common conditions." That wasn't observation, Webb. That was diagnosis. He identified symptoms I didn't notice until he pointed them out, and you responded as if his input was clinically valuable. "I've trained him in certain diagnostic indicators. It helps me provide better care." Whitfield's expression had hardened. "You've trained an enslaved man in medical diagnosis. Do you understand how dangerous that is? Not just to social order, but to your own reputation. If word spreads that you rely on a Negro's medical judgment, your professional credibility will be destroyed." The confrontation marked the end of the relatively safe period Samuel and Webb had operated in. Whitfield didn't officially report what he'd seen, but spoke of it privately to Richmond colleagues. Word began circulating carefully through Virginia's medical establishment. A physician in the Tidewater region had trained an enslaved assistant to unusual degree. Reports varied in details, but core claim remained consistent: an enslaved man was practicing medicine with disturbing competence. Dr. Webb recognized danger immediately. He reduced Samuel's visible role in the sick house, instructing him to be less forthcoming with observations, maintain more subservient demeanor. But damage had been done. Samuel's capabilities had been witnessed by someone outside their conspiracy of silence. In September 1837, Thomas Henley received a letter from the Virginia Medical Society. They were conducting a survey of plantation medical practices and wished to visit the Henley plantation to observe Dr. Webb's work. The letter was professionally courteous, but intent was clear. They were investigating rumors about Samuel. The Virginia Medical Society's investigation team arrived on October 15, 1837. 3 physicians, each distinguished in their field, each carrying scientific authority weight. Dr. Jonathan Breckinridge from Richmond, who had published extensively on racial anatomy. Dr. Samuel Harrison from Norfolk, specializing in plantation medicine. Dr. Charles Pendleton from Williamsburg, serving on Virginia Medical Journal's editorial board. They came ostensibly to document best practices in plantation healthcare. In reality, they came to assess whether a threat to scientific establishment existed on the Henley plantation. And if so, how to neutralize it. Thomas Henley received them with Virginia gentry hospitality. Fine tobacco and French brandy in the parlor. Dinner prepared by kitchen staff with precision, demonstrating plantation-generated wealth. Conversation ranging across politics, agriculture, and latest European medical developments. The physicians were charming, educated, cultivated. Nothing in their manner suggested the inquisition they intended to conduct. Dr. Webb had been given 3 days' notice of their visit. 3 days to prepare Samuel, coach him on maintaining appropriate demeanor, stress absolute necessity of hiding full knowledge extent. Samuel understood. He'd always understood. Performance of ignorance had been his survival strategy since childhood, but 3 years of working openly with Dr. Webb had eroded some caution. He'd grown accustomed to being respected for knowledge, having insights valued. The mask worn so carefully had slipped, and now these men had come to see what lay beneath. Investigation began next morning with tour of plantation's medical facilities. The sick house was clean, well organized, supplied with instruments and medications reflecting Dr. Webb's competence. Visiting physicians examined everything with careful attention. Noted surgical instruments, many showing signs of recent use and meticulous care. Observed organized pharmacy, medications labeled and stored properly. Reviewed Dr. Webb's case notes documenting treatments with appropriate detail. Samuel was present during inspection, standing quietly near the door, performing exactly expected role. Respectful silence, downcast eyes, prompt obedience to any instruction when addressed. The physicians barely acknowledged him, which was precisely appropriate to their worldview. An enslaved assistant was furniture, not a person requiring social recognition. But Dr. Breckinridge was more observant than colleagues. He noticed how Samuel's eyes followed their movements, how his posture shifted subtly when they examined particular instruments, how his expression changed momentarily when Dr. Harrison made an error identifying a surgical tool. Micro-expressions barely visible, but they suggested interior life engaged with proceedings rather than blank civility expected from enslaved people. The real test came that afternoon when a field worker was brought to sick house with dislocated shoulder. Injury had occurred during tobacco cutting, a sudden fall wrenching joint from socket. The man was in considerable pain, right arm hanging at unnatural angle. Dr. Webb prepared to reduce dislocation, a straightforward procedure performed dozens of times. Visiting physicians observed with professional interest. Exactly the kind of routine medical care they'd come to evaluate. Samuel prepared necessary materials without being asked. Clean cloths, wooden bit for patient to bite down on, rope for traction if needed. His movements were efficient, anticipating requirements. Too efficient, perhaps. Too knowledgeable about what procedure would entail. Dr. Webb positioned patient carefully, explaining technique to visiting physicians as he worked. Standard approach, traction with counter-traction, rotating humerus externally while applying gentle pressure. He grasped the man's arm, began applying traction, but his angle was slightly wrong. Shoulder wouldn't reduce, and patient's pain intensified. Samuel watched for 30 seconds, face carefully neutral. But as Webb struggled, Samuel's hands moved almost involuntarily, making small gestures showing correct rotation angle. A minute movement, barely noticeable, but Dr. Breckenridge saw it. More tellingly, Dr. Webb saw it and immediately adjusted technique based on Samuel's wordless correction. Shoulder reduced with audible pop, sliding back into socket. Patient gasped with relief as acute pain subsided. The room had gone very quiet. Dr. Breckenridge's eyes moved from Samuel to Dr. Webb and back again. That exchange, so brief, had revealed something no amount of careful performance could hide. Samuel knew exactly what Webb should have done, and Webb had responded to Samuel's guidance instinctively, without thought. After patient had been treated and sent back to quarters with arm in sling, visiting physicians requested private conversation with Dr. Webb. Samuel was dismissed, but as he left, he caught Dr. Breckenridge's gaze. The physician was looking at him the way a naturalist might examine an unexpected species, with mixture of scientific curiosity and profound unease. In Plantation House parlor, conversation began with careful courtesy. Dr. Breckenridge poured brandy for everyone, settling into chair with relaxed posture of man among peers. "Your assistant, Samuel," he began. "How long has he been working in your sick house?" 3 years, doctor." Webb replied, voice steadied despite tension. "Has proven quite capable at routine tasks." "More than routine, I think." Breckenridge took a sip of brandy. "He anticipated your needs during that procedure, knew which instruments to prepare without being told. And unless I'm mistaken, he corrected your technique. He's observed enough dislocations to recognize standard approach. Natural mimicry, nothing more." Harrison leaned forward. "Nathaniel, we've known each other for years. You can be frank with us. How much medical knowledge have you imparted to this man?" The Webb faced a decision. Lie convincingly, or admit enough truth to satisfy curiosity while protecting Samuel's full capabilities. "I've taught him to recognize common conditions, assist with basic treatments. It improves efficiency in managing enslaved populations' health." "That's not what we've been hearing." Dr. Pendleton spoke for first time, voice carrying an edge. "Word has reached Richmond that you've trained this man to perform diagnosis, that he practices medicine rather than merely assisting with it." "Who makes these claims?" "Does it matter? The claims exist. And what we observe today suggests foundation. That Negro knows medicine, Nathaniel. Question is how much and why you've allowed it." Conversation had reached crisis point. Webb could feel walls closing in, the safe arrangement he and Samuel maintained, collapsing under official scrutiny. "Because I thought knowledge could be contained. I thought if I supervised carefully, maintained control, his skills could benefit Plantation without threatening broader order." "Owner." Breckenridge set down glass with careful deliberation. "That reasoning demonstrates remarkable naivety. Knowledge in enslaved hands is never contained. It spreads. It creates expectations. It challenges the very foundations of system we depend upon. More importantly, it challenges scientific principles justifying that system. There it was, core issue. Not whether Samuel was helpful, not whether his medical care benefited enslaved community, but whether his existence contradicted theories underpinning racial slavery. I want to examine him. Dr. Breckenridge's voice had taken on harder quality. Formally, thoroughly. I want to determine true extent of his knowledge and how he acquired it. This isn't just plantation business anymore. Nathaniel. This touches questions of scientific importance. Thomas Henley, who had been listening from chair near fireplace, finally spoke. What exactly are you proposing, gentlemen? Comprehensive evaluation. Breckenridge turned to face him. We question him about medical knowledge, present cases to diagnose, assess whether apparent capabilities represent genuine understanding or sophisticated mimicry. Virginia Medical Society needs to know if this represents anomaly worthy of documentation or threat requiring suppression. Determine he possesses genuine medical knowledge. Then we must ask different theories about scientific misunderstanding of race upon. Breckenridge's expression was grim. Dr. Samuel Morton has spent years measuring skulls, documenting anatomical differences between races. His work forms foundation of our scientific understanding of racial capacity. If one enslaved man can master medicine without formal training, what does that say about Morton's theories? What does it say about all our assumptions? The room fell silent. They had finally articulated real danger. Not that Samuel was useful or intelligent, but that his intelligence challenged entire scientific framework built to justify racial hierarchy. If one enslaved person could demonstrate intellectual capacity equal to educated white men, then whole structure of supposedly scientific racism collapsed. And if that structure collapsed, what justified system it was designed to support? Examination was scheduled for 2 days later. Dr. Webb was given time to prepare, but preparation meant something different now. Not coaching Samuel on performing ignorance, but warning him hiding was no longer possible. Truth was about to be exposed, and consequences would be determined by men with every incentive to deny what they discovered. The night before examination, Samuel and Dr. Webb met in sick house after dark. The doctor looked haggard, aged by stress of previous days. Samuel, I've put you in terrible danger. I should never have begun teaching you openly. I should have maintained fiction that you were just capable assistant. Would that have been more honest? Samuel asked quietly. Would hiding what I am have changed anything except timing of this moment? It might have kept you safe. Safe. Samuel's voice carried bitter edge. I've never been safe. None of us are. We live in a system that treats us as property. And you think performing ignorance makes us safe? It just makes our oppression more comfortable for people who profit from it. Dr. Webb had no answer. Truth of it was too stark, too undeniable. Examination took place in Thomas Henley's library, a room lined with books Samuel had secretly read over years of stolen learning. 3 visiting physicians arranged themselves behind large table, creating tribunal atmosphere. Dr. Webb stood to one side, officially supervising but effectively powerless. Thomas Henley sat in corner, present to protect property interests, but clearly uncomfortable with entire proceeding. Samuel stood before them, and for first time in years, he did not lower eyes. Something had changed in him over past days. Anger suppressed so long, rage at having to hide his mind, pretend stupidity to survive, all crystallized into cold determination. They were going to examine him. Fine. He would show them exactly what they feared. Dr. Breckenridge began with basic questions. Define inflammation. Explain heart function. Describe major human skeleton bones. Samuel answered each precisely, responses matching what any medical student would provide. But basic questions weren't real test. Dr. Harrison presented case study. Patient with sudden severe right lower abdomen pain, fever, nausea, localized tenderness. Diagnosis and treatment: appendicitis. Samuel's response immediate. Likely acute inflammation, possibly approaching rupture given severity. Treatment requires surgical removal before perforation leads to peritonitis. Surgery must be performed quickly, but carefully to avoid spreading infection into abdominal cavity. Physicians exchanged glances. Diagnosis correct, reasoning sound, treatment appropriate. They pressed further with more complex cases. Child with whooping cough, woman with puerperal fever after childbirth, man with symptoms suggesting tuberculosis. Each time Samuel's responses demonstrated not just knowledge, but clinical judgment. Dr. Pendleton changed tactics. Instead of medical questions, he pulled out Latin medical terminology text and asked Samuel to translate. Samuel did so fluently. Then Greek anatomical terms. Then French passages from recent European medical journal. Samuel handled each language with same facility. Translations accurate, comprehension obvious. Where did you learn classical languages? Pendleton demanded. Same place I learned anatomy, sir, from books in this library. You're claiming you taught yourself Latin and Greek without instruction. Merely from reading texts. Yes, sir. Languages follow patterns. Once you understand grammar and build vocabulary, reading becomes possible. Simplicity of Samuel's explanation made it sound almost reasonable, as if anyone could master multiple languages through self-directed study. But everyone in room understood how extraordinary that claim was. Self-taught polyglot ability suggested cognitive capacity, directly contradicting theories of racial intellectual limitation. Dr. Breckenridge pulled out text Samuel had never seen. Recently published surgical techniques treatise from Edinburgh. He opened to complex passage describing new aneurysm treatment procedure. Read this and explained surgical approach described. Samuel read passage once, then explained not just technique, but underlying logic. Anatomical challenges addressed, potential complications arising. His explanation was clearer than original text, demonstrating not just comprehension, but ability to synthesize and clarify complex information. Examination continued for 3 hours. Mathematical problems related to medication dosing, chemical formulas for various compounds, questions about pathophysiology, embryology, comparative anatomy. They threw everything they could think of at Samuel, searching desperately for knowledge boundary, point where mimicry would fail and reveal itself as mere memorization without understanding. They never found that boundary. Every question, no matter how complex or unexpected, met with answers demonstrating genuine comprehension. Samuel didn't just know facts. He understood principles. He could reason through novel problems. He could explain his thinking. He could identify errors in their questions or challenge assumptions embedded in premises. Finally, Dr. Breckenridge posed question implicit throughout examination. Samuel, do you understand what you represent? Do you comprehend why your existence is so problematic for men like us? I understand that I contradict theories you need to believe are true. Samuel's voice was steady, but something fierce burned beneath calm surface. You've built entire scientific frameworks, claiming people who look like me cannot do what I've just demonstrated I can do. And now you must decide. Acknowledge your theories are wrong, or find ways to dismiss me as such extreme anomaly that I prove nothing. We're not dismissing you. Dr. Breckenridge's face had gone pale. We're trying to understand you. No, sir. You're trying to contain me. You're trying to find a way to explain my existence that doesn't require questioning foundation of everything you believe about race and human capacity. Because if you admit I'm not impossible anomaly, If you acknowledge, I simply demonstrate what many enslaved people could achieve given opportunity. Then you must confront injustice of system you defend. The room had gone dead silent. Dr. Harrison's hands were shaking. Dr. Pendleton had stood, chair scraping loudly against floor. Thomas Henley looked stricken, as if realizing for first time that his property possessed not just intelligence, but moral clarity, exposing violence of property relation itself. Dr. Webb closed his eyes, knowing Samuel had just destroyed any possibility of survival. You could not speak those words to powerful white men in 1837 Virginia and expect to remain unpunished. The truth Samuel articulated was too dangerous, too devastating to worldview these men depended upon. Dr. Breckenridge recovered first. Professional demeanor returned, cold and analytical. Your facility with argument doesn't change certain facts. This examination has revealed something extraordinary, yes, but also something dangerous. Knowledge of this nature in someone of your condition represents threat to social order that cannot continue unchecked. What do you propose? Thomas Henley asked, voice tight. Physicians conferred briefly in whispers. Then Breckenridge turned back. This situation requires documentation and careful management. We'll report to Virginia Medical Society. Samuel will need relocation where capabilities can be monitored and where he'll have no opportunity to spread learning to others. You mean sold away? Dr. Webb's voice was hollow. We mean secured. The distinction was cold comfort. Samuel would be removed from Henley Plantation, separated from community he'd served, placed somewhere his knowledge would die with him. If you're intrigued by how power structures work to suppress knowledge, threatening their foundations, ensure you're subscribed to The Sealed Room. We uncover stories challenging official narratives and expose mechanisms of intellectual control. Comment your thoughts on what happened to Samuel. Now, let's discover what scientific establishment decided to do with the man who proved their theories were lies. The formal report submitted to Virginia Medical Society by Breckenridge, Harrison, and Pendleton was a masterpiece of evasion and obfuscation. It acknowledged enslaved man on Henley Plantation, demonstrated unusual facility with medical knowledge, but carefully avoided stating true extent of Samuel's capabilities. Instead, report emphasized danger of allowing enslaved people access to intellectual domains beyond their station, warned against risks of such knowledge spreading, and recommended strict plantation medical care protocols preventing similar situations elsewhere. What report did not include was any acknowledgement that Samuel had challenged core assumptions of racial science. It didn't mention fluency in multiple languages, mathematical capabilities, ability to reason through novel problems with sophistication matching, or exceeding educated physicians. It didn't document that he demonstrated every intellectual capacity scientific racism claimed was impossible for African-descended people. Omission was deliberate. To document Samuel's full capabilities honestly would have required Virginia Medical Society to confront questions they couldn't answer without undermining their own authority and social order that authority supported. So they chose different path, acknowledged enough to justify action, but suppressed enough to avoid forcing examination of foundational assumptions. Private correspondence between three examining physicians told different story. Letters sealed and marked confidential expressed genuine shock at what they'd witnessed. Dr. Harrison wrote Philadelphia colleague that he'd encountered intelligence that in any other circumstances would be considered remarkable. Dr. Pendleton admitted in diary that examination had shaken confidence in theories previously defended without hesitation. But Dr. Breckenridge's response was most revealing. In letter to Dr. Samuel Morton himself, he described examination in careful detail. laying out Samuel's demonstrated capabilities honestly. Then posed question cutting to heart of dilemma. If we acknowledge this man possesses intellectual capacity we claim is impossible for his race, we must explain how our measurements and theories failed to predict his existence. Either our science is wrong, or he represents such extreme outlier that his case proves nothing about broader population. First option destroys our scientific authority. Second option feels like intellectual cowardice, choosing comfortable conclusions over uncomfortable truths. Dr. Morton's response came 6 weeks later. His letter was coldly analytical. He acknowledged challenge Samuel represented, but argued extraordinary anomalies don't invalidate general principles. Just as humans occasionally born with 6 fingers don't disprove that humans have 5 fingers, one unusually intelligent Negro doesn't disprove general pattern of racial intellectual differences documented by measurements. Morton's logic was circular, defining pattern based on his measurements, then dismissing contrary evidence as anomalous. But it gave Breckinridge intellectual framework needed to maintain beliefs despite encountering contradictory evidence. Arrangement for Samuel's relocation was handled with cold efficiency characterizing business transactions in human property. Thomas Henley, under pressure from Virginia Medical Society and concerned about reputation, agreed to sell Samuel to buyer who could provide what they called appropriate oversight. Buyer was South Carolina physician named Dr. Elias Cunningham, who maintained small private medical research facility. Sale was finalized in December 1837. Samuel was given no choice, no voice in determining fate. One morning, he was informed he'd be leaving within week. Mother, barely known, had died years earlier. No wife, no children. Community served with secret medical knowledge could only watch as he was taken away, understanding his removal was punishment for crime of being too intelligent, too capable, too dangerous to lies white society told itself. Dr. Webb came to say goodbye night before departure. They met in sick house one final time, surrounded by instruments and medicines that had been tools of their collaboration. Doctor's face was haggard with guilt and grief. "I should have protected you better," Webb said. "I should have understood danger. I was putting you in by teaching you openly." Samuel shook his head. "You gave me something no one else could. You treated my mind as worthy of development. You respected my intelligence. That was a gift, even if it's ending like this. It shouldn't end like this. You could have been a physician. In just world, you'd have been educated at finest medical schools, published research, saved countless lives. Instead, you're being sold to research facility in South Carolina like laboratory specimen." Injustice hung between them like smoke. Both understood Samuel's crime wasn't ignorance, but its opposite. He demonstrated intellectual limitations, supposedly inherent to his race were lies, and for that truth-telling, he'd be removed from sight, knowledge buried, capabilities suppressed. "What will you do?" Samuel asked quietly. "Continue practicing medicine as if nothing happened?" Webb was silent long moment. "I don't know if I can. Every time I treat patient, I'll remember enslaved man with no formal education performed surgery I couldn't. Every time I read racial science, I'll know it's built on foundations of sand. But acknowledging that publicly would destroy my career and change nothing about system. So perhaps I'll continue practicing and carry knowledge of my own intellectual cowardice until I die." Honesty of this admission was devastating. Webb would go on treating patients, teaching students, upholding medical establishment, built partially on lies he now recognized as lies. He would live with comfort of position and corrosion of conscience. It was a choice, and he knew it was a choice, which made it both more honest and more damning than simple ignorance. Samuel arrived at Dr. Cunningham's South Carolina facility in January 1838. Place was smaller than expected. Converted plantation house with several outbuildings modified for medical purposes. Dr. Cunningham was in his 50s. Medical career respectable, but never distinguished. He'd published few papers, maintained small practice, and increasingly focused energies on what he called anatomical research. Research consisted primarily of dissections. Dr. Cunningham purchased bodies of enslaved people who died on nearby plantations and occasionally received executed criminals from local authorities. He dissected these bodies carefully, taking measurements, making sketches, collecting specimens preserved in formaldehyde jars. His goal was to document anatomical differences between races that would provide physical evidence for intellectual hierarchies. Men like Samuel Morton claimed to have proven through skull measurements. Samuel's role in this facility was initially unclear. Dr. Cunningham had been informed only that he was acquiring an enslaved man with unusual medical knowledge who required isolation from broader enslaved population. First weeks, Samuel was simply another worker assigned to maintain facility, prepare bodies for dissection, clean instruments. But Dr. Cunningham was observant. He noticed how Samuel moved around laboratory with familiarity rather than revulsion, how eyes followed dissections with professional interest rather than horror, how hands, when cleaning instruments, demonstrated careful attention of someone understanding their medical purpose. One evening, as Dr. Cunningham performed heart dissection, Samuel couldn't contain himself. Standing at room edge, supposedly cleaning, he watched Doctor struggle to separate interventricular septum properly. Technique was wrong, risking damage to structures Cunningham presumably wanted preserved for examination. "Your angle is too steep," Samuel said quietly. "You're cutting through septum rather than along it. If you adjust to more lateral approach, you'll separate chambers while preserving valve structures." Dr. Cunningham's head snapped up. Expression moved through surprise to suspicion to curiosity. "Show me what you mean." Samuel approached table. With Cunningham's reluctant permission, he took scalpel and demonstrated proper dissection technique, hands moving with confidence of someone who'd studied anatomical illustrations until three-dimensional relationships burned into memory. He separated chambers cleanly, exposing internal structures without damaging them. Dr. Cunningham stared at exposed heart, then at Samuel, then back at heart. "Where did you learn to do that?" "From books, sir, and from observing, and from understanding logical structure of how bodies are organized." This began strange period in Samuel's life. Dr. Cunningham, fascinated despite himself, began questioning Samuel about knowledge. Unlike Virginia physicians, Cunningham had no investment in suppressing what he discovered. His medical career had been mediocre enough that he had little reputation to protect, and curiosity outweighed ideological commitments. Over following months, Samuel became Cunningham's research assistant in fact, if not title. They performed dissections together, discussed anatomical variations, debated medical theories, and slowly, despite every social prohibition, developed something approximating collegial relationship. But this couldn't last. Dr. Cunningham, eager to advance own standing, made catastrophic decision. He began writing about observations. In letters to colleagues and draft papers intended for medical journals, he described Samuel's capabilities in detail. Documented dissections Samuel performed, diagnoses made, medical reasoning demonstrated. Cunningham framed these observations as evidence of own brilliance in recognizing and documenting such unusual case. But what he actually documented was proof that racial science was built on fraudulent foundations. In April 1847, Dr. Cunningham sent most detailed account to Dr. Samuel Morton at Philadelphia Medical Journal. Letter described Samuel's capabilities with scientific precision, laying out evidence that enslaved man possessed medical and anatomical knowledge, exceeding many trained physicians. Cunningham requested Morton publish findings as case study in unusual intellectual capacity. Dr. Morton's response was letter that arrived that Tuesday morning and was burned within hours of being read. What that letter said, we can only infer from Morton's subsequent actions and fragmentary evidence surviving. But consequences were immediate and severe. Within 2 weeks, Dr. Cunningham received visit from 3 men. Colleague from South Carolina Medical Society, representative from Samuel Morton himself, legal agent representing regional plantation owners who'd heard rumors about Cunningham's research. Message they delivered was unambiguous. Publication of findings about Samuel would destroy Cunningham's career, damage Southern medicine reputation, provide dangerous ammunition to abolitionist movements. Research must be terminated, documentation destroyed, subject disposed of quietly. Dr. Cunningham protested initially. This was important scientific work, documentation of extraordinary case. But pressure brought to bear was overwhelming. Professional ostracism, threats of legal action, hints of violence. Scientific establishment had decided Samuel represented too great threat to be allowed continuing existence as evidence of fraudulent theories. Samuel learned of these discussions through overheard conversations. He understood immediately what was coming. System had decided he couldn't be allowed to live as walking contradiction to certainties. Only question was how they'd accomplish removal. Solution they settled on was elegant in simplicity. Dr. Cunningham would sell Samuel to buyer from deep south. Someone engaged in sugar or cotton trades where life expectancy for enslaved workers rarely exceeded few years. Brutal labor conditions would solve problem without requiring explicit action. Samuel would simply disappear into grinding machinery of plantation agriculture. Knowledge dying with him. Challenge to racial science erased. But before this could be arranged, Samuel made own decision. He'd spent entire life accommodating system, demanding he hide intelligence, suppress capabilities, perform inferiority to make white people comfortable. He'd survived by pretending to be what they needed him to be. Now, facing removal to conditions killing him within years, he decided survival was no longer only value worth prioritizing. On night of May 7, 1847, Samuel left detailed documentation of everything he knew. He wrote for 8 hours straight, filling pages with anatomical drawings, medical observations, surgical techniques, diagnostic procedures. He documented not just medical knowledge, but own intellectual journey. How he'd learned, what he'd discovered, conclusions reached about fraudulent nature of racial science. He left these pages in Dr. Cunningham's laboratory, where they'd be found. Then he walked away from facility and disappeared into South Carolina night. What happened to Samuel after that night remains unknown. He vanished from historical record as completely as if he'd never existed. No sale records, capture notices, death certificates, simply gone. Some historians speculate he reached free territory. Others believe he died attempting escape. Still others think he may have lived out days under assumed identity. Remarkable mind, hidden, once again beneath performance of ordinariness. We will never know for certain. What we do know is what happened to documentation he left behind. Dr. Cunningham discovered pages next morning. He read with growing awe and horror, recognizing that Samuel had produced in one night compendium of medical knowledge and original thinking rivaling anything Cunningham had seen from trained physicians. And then Dr. Cunningham burned it all. Every page, every drawing, every word. He burned evidence of Samuel's capabilities and own failure to protect someone whose intelligence he'd come to respect. Burning took hours, and Cunningham wept while doing it. understanding he was destroying something irreplaceable, because preserving it would destroy own position in system that couldn't tolerate truth Samuel represented. But memory, unlike paper, cannot be completely burned. Dr. Cunningham couldn't forget what he'd witnessed. In private journals, entries surviving because never intended for publication, he wrote about Samuel with mixture of admiration and grief, described dissections performed together, documented conversations challenging understanding of human capacity, admitted in writing never shown anyone that Samuel had been his intellectual superior in every meaningful way. These journal entries were discovered in 1968 during estate sale after Cunningham's last descendant died. They provided first solid documentation that Samuel had existed at all, that rumors whispered about impossible enslaved physician had basis in fact. Historians began searching for additional evidence, piecing together fragments from medical society records, plantation ledgers, private correspondence. Picture emerging was incomplete but devastating. Samuel had been real. His capabilities had been documented by multiple credible witnesses, and scientific establishment of antebellum America had deliberately suppressed evidence of his existence because acknowledging it would have required admitting their theories were lies to justify economic system dependent on human exploitation. Dr. Samuel Morton, whose skull measurements supposedly proved racial intellectual hierarchies, never published anything about Samuel's case. Letter from Dr. Cunningham went into personal files, and after Morton's death in 1851, those files were curated by colleagues who removed anything controversial. Letter about Samuel disappeared, though references to it in other correspondence prove it existed. Virginia Medical Society's records from 1837 show unexplained gaps. Official proceedings make no mention of Samuel's examination, though private letters between society members reference it obliquely. Someone at some point removed documentation that would have made Samuel's case part of historical record. This suppression wasn't accidental. It was systematic, coordinated, deliberate. Samuel represented proof that scientific racism undergirding slavery was fraudulent, and that proof had to be erased to maintain ideological structures justifying enormous wealth extraction through human bondage. But suppression is never complete. Knowledge has way of surviving attempts to destroy it. Whispered stories in enslaved community about man who could heal with impossible skill. Fragmentary journal entries. Gaps in official records pointing toward what was removed. All bear witness to what establishment tried to erase. What do we learn from Samuel's story? Not comfortable lesson that individual brilliance transcends oppression. Samuel's brilliance didn't save him, it destroyed him. What we learn instead is how systems of power respond when confronted with evidence contradicting foundational lies. They don't reconsider assumptions. They suppress evidence, eliminate threat, protect authority by erasing challenges to it. Scientific establishment of antebellum America wasn't ignorant. Physicians examining Samuel weren't stupid. They were intelligent men who chose to defend theories they knew or suspected were wrong, because admitting error would have undermined social position and economic system benefiting them. That choice, to value comfort and power over intellectual honesty, is more damning than simple ignorance. Samuel's story also reveals something about nature of genius under oppression. We will never know how many people of extraordinary capability were destroyed by slavery. Potential extinguished. Contributions to human knowledge lost forever. Samuel is remarkable not because he was unique, but because fragments of his story survived suppression. How many others existed whose brilliance we'll never know about because documentation was more thoroughly destroyed? Tragedy isn't just Samuel's individual fate, it's systematic destruction of human potential slavery represented. Millions denied education, opportunity, chance to develop and contribute capabilities. Human cost of that destruction is incalculable, and scientific fraud justifying it continued long after slavery ended. Racial science, supposed measurement of intellectual capacity, hierarchies built on manipulated data and circular reasoning, all persisted into 20th century. Some assumptions still lurk in contemporary discourse, disguised with new vocabulary, but serving similar purposes of justifying inequality. Samuel's existence proved science was fraudulent. His story demonstrates fraud was known by its architects, who chose suppression over acknowledgement, and his disappearance shows how thoroughly systems of power will work to eliminate evidence challenging authority. If you've watched this far, you understand why stories like Samuel's matter, not because they're inspirational triumph tales, but because they reveal how power structures actually function when threatened. They show us official narratives, scientific consensus, accepted wisdom. All can be manufactured to serve interests rather than truth. And they remind us absence of evidence often means evidence destroyed, not evidence never existing. Gaps in historical record aren't accidents, they're erasures. Learning to read those erasures, understand what gaps tell us about what was deliberately removed. Essential to understanding how power maintains itself through controlling knowledge. Samuel's impossible brain threatened entire structure of scientific racism. So they made him disappear, burned documentation, suppressed witnesses, chose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths, and for more than centuries succeeded in keeping story buried. But knowledge once created leaves traces. Those of us willing to look at what was hidden, ask why certain stories were suppressed, challenge official narratives, we can recover some of what was destroyed. Not completely, never completely, but enough to understand what was taken from us and why. Samuel existed. His mind was real, his capabilities challenged everything antebellum science claimed about race and intelligence. And fact that story was deliberately erased tells everything about relationship between power and truth in systems built on exploitation. What other stories have been buried because they contradicted convenient lies? What other evidence destroyed because preserving it would have required powerful people to admit they were wrong? These questions are worth asking because suppression mechanisms Samuel experience didn't end with slavery. They continue in every system where truth threatens power. Evidence contradicts authority. Knowledge challenges foundations of inequality. If this story changed how you think about reliability of official narratives and relationship between science and power, share with someone who needs to understand how suppression works. Comment what struck you most about Samuel's story. Ensure you're subscribed to The Sealed Room. We specialize in uncovering knowledge power, structures tried to bury, stories they wanted forgotten, evidence they tried to destroy, voices they attempted to silence. History isn't just what happened. It's what we're allowed to remember. And sometimes most important history is hidden in gaps, erasures, deliberate absences in official record. Samuel's story was one of those absences. Now you know why it was hidden. And knowing why it was hidden might be most important lesson of all.